祇園少女の鐘の声、諸行無常の響きあり、シャラ掃除の花の色、乗車必須の断りを表す。ただし俺たちを除いてな。
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. Happy holidays and all that. Now, I'm a little behind schedule, but that's alright. Everything's progressing just fine. Today we're going to be talking about the Lords of Cinder, the iconic main bosses of Dark Souls 3, and what it means to be a Lord of Cinder. So what that is essentially someone who linked the first flame and ushered, or rather prolonged, the Age of Fire through another cycle. The first Lord of Cinder was Gwyn, who really only sacrificed himself to the flame because he knew it was the only thing that would prolong the Age of the Gods. Now, before he jumped into the fire, he had his serpent buddy set a system in place that shepherded others to follow in Gwyn's footsteps, namely the undead, humans, beings of the dark that Gwyn feared so much. They turned out to be the perfect sacrificial lambs. Their dark soul made them strong and suitable as it didn't lose power through its inheritors. So, what it did was essentially provide the gods with an endless string of sacrifices to the flame to keep their age going. If only Gwyn had lived to see how successful his plan worked. And the plan itself was simple enough for the snake and the illustrious Way of White, who we will be talking about later. I mean, think about it. All they had to do was tell the subjects that they're following in the footsteps of a god, the king of the city of gods. And guess what? They're going to behave like the pawns that they're viewed as. And meanwhile, that very same god is the one who placed a shackle upon their entire race that drained their shared dark soul of its true power. Dude's a real prick. But honestly, what else is there to say about Gwyn that hasn't already been said by many other channels and people?
How about the fact that I hate my son?
Couldn't help myself. Yeah, he hates his son. He disowned him and had his name erased from existence for being friendly with dragons, or maybe not wanting to link the flame in his dad's stead. It's really tough to say, although it's probably the dragon thing. His other son he had raised as a girl just because he was born under the sign of the moon or something. But yeah, Gwen's kind of a shit parent. I mean, it's no wonder Guinevere ran off with some random guy named Flan who was never mentioned again. Filianor actually doesn't know how lucky she had it, being sent away to a really fucking cool looking ring city at the end of the world. I mean, all she had to do was entertain some fucking pygmies. How hard could that have been? See, now I'm getting a little bit off topic, but anyway, the first Lord of Cinder was Gwyn, and he was followed by, potentially, the chosen undead, the protagonist of Dark Souls 1, and that goofy bastard Solaire, optionally, if you decide to help him out. Vendrick of Dark Souls 2 never linked the flame, or sat the throne as it was called in his day, though that was mainly due to the machinations of his lovely wife, Nishandra. He never became a true lord, but the bearer of the curse could have if we so choose, or we can abandon the throne to see what comes next. Now, by the time of Dark Souls 3, numerous cycles have passed, and countless individuals have linked the flame, people whose names have been lost to history. There were also those who tried to link the flame and even made it all the way up to the kiln only to effectively die trying to link it. They didn't have the makings of a varsity athlete and were in essence rejected as kindling for the flame. Now, when the first flame faded eons later and its resurrected lords had also abandoned their post, as in the case of Dark Souls 3, the unkindled were brought back from the Cemetery of Ash to help the lords along their way in the most FromSoft approved method possible, killing them and in the process acquiring their power, or enough power to link the flame ourselves after first burning the cinders of the missing lords. And then it's off to Sacrifice Hill with you. I mean, the end game here, if you're trying to link the flame, is your fiery demise. But first you have to battle it out with this Soul of Cinder that's sort of this amalgamation or mass of souls of the previous lords that have linked the flame in this new form of cover art man. I was disappointed he didn't pick up some of the ashes and let it, slip through his fingers. But you square off with him in what turns out to be a surprisingly easy boss fight, and boom, the end. fire linked and you're now a Lord of Cinder, or or the fire's been usurped or smothered, whichever you may choose. See, no matter which ending you go with, you still have to hunt down the lords for their cinders, since they are literally a part of the flame itself, and the flame can't be usurped or snuffed out unless it's whole. See, after you play by its rules, you can do essentially whatever you want. You can change the future of the world. And that's a big result of the sort of automated interface nature of the first flame and how it powers the world or whatever it does. It brought back the unkindled ashen ones for its own self-preservation so that they could go slay the lords and bring their cinders back to the fire to restart it again, But what it couldn't account for was the human variable. These unkindled ashes developing a will of their own and choosing to seek out a different ending. And I think that's ultimately what Gwyn feared most about humans, is the potential darkness of their soul, or something like that. Which I might add, by the time of Dark Souls 3, had become quite stagnated and twisted, the dark soul of man, or at least a big chunk of it. But that's something I should talk about in another video, maybe about the pus of man. Let me know what you think in the comments. But let's move on to the first entry on this list besides Gwyn, Aldrich. He's actually got the most story to him, in my opinion, but Aldrich is perhaps the most odd of all of the known Lords of Cinder. He was a corpulent cleric of the Way of White back in his day. Remember Petrus and his shifty buddies that even Patches has a particular dislike of in the first game? He's basically just another one of those dudes, except way more successful. But yeah, that's what Aldrich was. He was a cleric of the Way of White, which itself was devoted to the gods of Anor Londo and their blessings/miracles. And much like those fat bastards we killed in the first game, Aldrich held a much darker nature than his line of work let on. Much, much darker, actually. Dude was a cannibal that feasted on human flesh, and that was really just the start of it. The only thing he liked more than the act of eating human flesh was the sound his victims made as they cried out and finally accepted what was about to happen to them, or what was currently happening to them while they were being slowly consumed by this literal monster. And much like Stephen King's It, this fear, this agony, this defeat, it gave him strength. Immense strength, in fact. He was one of the most powerful beings of his age. But he was gluttonous, extremely gluttonous in fact. He ate so much that he burst, and eventually settled into this sludge worm-like being. Think of Aldrich as just a larger version of one of those sludge slugs that we see in the swamps and in the Palace of Anor Londo, amongst other places, because that's literally what he became, essentially just a larger one of those guys. So he was a monster on the inside and a monster on the outside, but he was still ridiculously strong. So strong, in fact, that the other members of the Way of White were willing to look the other way when it came to his, shall we call them, eccentricities, eating people and the like. And thus, Aldrich, the worm-like slug demon, began to amass followers and influence. People liked what he was putting down, so to speak, and so he became quite popular. But because of his new slug-like physiology, the Way of White's new leadership in Anor Londo couldn't ignore his darker nature entirely, so they stationed him at the Cathedral of the Deep and sort of hoped for the best. The pontiff likely patted himself on the back for, this ingenious plan of his, but it would come to bite him in the ass eventually, somewhere down the road. Anyway, so Aldrich was stationed at the cathedral, out of sight and out of mind. He was given a doll, an enchanted one that would allow him to return to Irithyll one day, but who knows if the leadership of the Way of White ever had any intention of allowing that at the time that they gave it to him and made this promise. Any plans the good pontiff might have had for Aldrich were at least a couple centuries down the line. So this Cathedral of the Deep that Aldrich was now stationed at was once dedicated to the goddess of tears, Caitha, a Dark Souls 2 deity from Dranlake that would become associated with the nation Kirim from Dark Souls 1. The Way of White added her to its pantheon and presumably built her this grand holy site, so it's clear she's important. She also may or may not be Velka, but that's a whole other bag of worms entirely. So the cathedral's original purpose seems to have been as a place where even the darkest of beings could be cleansed of their sins via the waters. Think Uncle Baby Billy. Sort of like some real-world religious beliefs that people have. It looks like they even brought the pus of man afflicted individuals here at some point in an attempt to cleanse the darkness from them. A lot of good that must have done, but it was immortalized. Eventually, though, all of the darkness and horrors that it was forced to take in took its toll, or maybe perhaps sending Aldrich's twisted ass there sped up the process. Maybe his profound depravity altered the holy water of this great cathedral, the waters that are its very purpose. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe the combined amount of just darkness and sins that were forced to be cleansed here mixed with Aldrich's insane depravity. Maybe that was just finally the straw that broke the camel's back. It's tough to say, but the end result remains the same. The deep became corrupted and the waters here stagnated, with the place itself becoming sort of a waking nightmare. Now the big slug was in complete control, or at least his followers were, of this once holy place. Aldrich's faith was gluttonously pervasive, and the cathedral itself would begin to reflect that. His deacons and bishops covered up all traces of Catha, disposing of her chime and covering her statues with tarps. As you can imagine, the staff of the cathedral was now openly and firmly dedicating themselves to Aldrich, as well as the site itself. Flesh-eating, toothed worms were the envoys of this great change, and they were also there to stay. Meanwhile, Aldrich himself ruminated on the fading of the flame, and dreamt of a deep sea where the heaviest parts of the soul would sink to the very bottom of the world, forming the very bedrock of the earth. Think of what happened with the waters of the cathedral itself as a sort of microcosm for this. The constant cleansing of dark beings had caused the heaviest dregs of humanity to sink down and form the sea floor, the bedrock, sinking into its very roots and basically corrupting the waters at its core. Or at least that's how Archdeacon MacDonald interpreted it. And this to them was the way of the future, which ultimately wasn't too far off as we see in the Dreg Heap, but anyway, the cathedral began to adopt a much more sinister nature following its corruption.
This place was for the sick. No sickness now.
Aldrich just basically used it as a convenient way to gorge himself with his favorite food. Seriously, his red-eyed bishops sent out the fat evangelists to places like the Undead Settlement to provide a steady stream of cursed human sacrifices for the old blob to grub on. The place became a genuine house of horrors under the watchful eye of Aldrich and his subordinates. Aldrich wasn't just a cannibal, he took pleasure in imbibing the final shudders of life as it drained from his screaming victims. The fear and despair was very much a part of it for him. Think of it like seasoning one's food. Their anguish was his garlic or black pepper. It just made his food taste all the more better. Aldrich was nothing if not a connoisseur, and he loved what he did so much that he wanted to share the joy of eating people with his closest followers. This resulted in the creation of his two most experimental rings, the ruby and sapphire of Aldrich, that could drain the life and energy out of their wearer's foes, but there was a catch. Dark magic often had a dark price, and these rings would eventually transform their owners into giant, horrific tarantula guys, or rather monsters, which isn't surprising given the foul magic that was likely used to create the rings in the first place. Although knowing Aldrich, the fact that it turned the wearers into monsters could have very much been the point, or by design. Again, he was a pretty twisted dude, and maybe he thought he was turning them into their true forms, like what happened to him after he ate so much he turned into a nasty slug. It's sort of hard to get into the mind of a guy like that. I mean, we've talked about it to death. Aldrich ate so much that he literally became a slug blob of muck, and, some of his subordinates did it so much that they became hairy spiders, so it's kind of interesting to think about. Although I will say that those rings are pretty useful, or they used to be at least. I don't know if they got nerfed and my information is outdated. But let's move on. So, as one of the most powerful individuals of his time, it made sense that Aldrich would go on to link the flame, but not because he cared about the world or the flame, but simply because he could. Also, it's not like he could go back home. He had sort of been banned from there. I mean, the guy was probably an Irithilian who was not allowed to return home to Irithil for obvious reasons, but it's something to think about. Plus, by this point, Aldrich had probably eaten his fill of the world, so maybe he was willing to link the fire just because of that. The real reason he linked the fire, though, was because the leadership of the Way of White wanted it. He was strong enough, and somebody had to keep the gravy train going, so to speak, and he fit the bill. He had faith in his visions as well, and he believed in the deep, and he had done his part to further his goals, and guess what? He had also enjoyed himself in the process, so maybe he was content here. The guy had a pretty impressive life, I guess, and it was a smart move to go out like this because the flame would eventually repay him with his revival some ages later when the world was even more stagnated and closer to the deep from the numerous linkings of the fire, that he was actually better off. He was actually closer to his dream. Anyway, after he linked the fire, Aldrich was laid to rest at the cathedral, and ages passed by, and guess what? The place became even more fucked. One of Aldrich's bitches, or bishops, would flip sides and begin serving the Lady Rosaria that resided in the hidden part of the cathedral, which is also a whole other thing. You know, Rosaria's identity and all that. But eventually, the fire would wake Aldrich up, and guess what? He wanted to get back to work. After eating his fill of the sacrifices that had been brought to him from the undead settlement, he decided that it was finally time to return to Irithil, his home. He grew tired of consuming humans in their darkness and instead wanted to dine on the ultimate palate cleanser in the form of a godly meal. Now, by this point, there was only one remaining full god in Anor Londo, and that was Gwendolyn. And he was ill, or maybe he was poisoned by Pontiff, but whatever the reason, he was out of commission, and Sullivan of the Painted World was now in charge of Irithil, Aldrich's homeland. Sullivan having proclaimed himself Pontiff after a very successful coup against Gwendolyn, allegedly. So what did Aldrich do? The revived Lord of Cinder marched on Irithil with his many followers and broke the Knights of Sullivan, their armor and weapons eaten away by the countless writhing insects of the deep, and pretty much all of their forces were overwhelmed, and the good Pontiff was forced to concede defeat and allow Aldrich readmittance to his home city. But ever the schemer, Sullivan had a plan to regain or at least maintain control of the city, as Aldrich had no real desire to rule these lands. So Sullivan gave Aldrich the last known god of Anor Londo, Gwendolyn, to feast upon. You know, he figured that would keep him busy for a while. And he was right. Aldrich would take his sweet time devouring Moonboy here, and the Pontiff was seemingly able to return to his duties, rolling over Irithil, only now with a few more, let's call them less than wanted guests. Now, some of the interlopers were treated better than others, as far as I can tell. The good Pontiff left the deacons and the Aldrich faithful to their own devices, while he presumably imprisoned an evangelist for annoying him to all hell. I mean, that's speculation, but it makes sense to me on Sullivan's part, because he probably figured, well, it's not like Aldrich is going to take time away from eating that precious god meat to break her out, or even notice what happened, let alone care. The dude is, for lack of a better term, preoccupied. Remember, he's in it for the love of the game, as this motherfucker just loves eating people. So, whilst Aldrich was dining on Gwendolyn, he dreamt of something peculiar. A young woman in hiding, a pale one to be exact, and it was none other than Priscilla of the Painted World. And I think this could have meant a number of things. It could have hinted at the true DLC ending, I mean, if you can call it that. The world ends and the survivors supposedly escape into the new painted world that has been colored with the literal dark soul of man. It's a place where the dark could truly flourish beyond whatever came next and beyond the shackles that Gwen placed on them. It's something beyond a supposed age of the deep or whatever it was we saw when we fought Gale in the future. I mean, if nothing else, Aldrich dreaming of this in particular has more meaning after the DLCs. It and the Merkmen show us that his dreams were in fact prophetic, if a bit vague. The dreams were spot on some details though, what with the human dregs sinking down to the very lowest points of the earth to form the bedrock of the world. But what could his dream of Priscilla mean? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and speculate some somewhat baseless speculation or whatever. Try to derive meaning from which maybe there was none intended. Alright, so the fact that he dreamt of Priscilla in this particular manner makes me lean toward it possibly meaning something along the lines of that even in the endless deep sea, a place for the forlorn souls will exist, somewhere that the lost could escape the world to. Now, of course, the dream could also have something to do with Aldrich's dealings with the Pontiff, who also hailed from the Painted World. Not to mention, some people do seem to think that Pontiff may have killed Priscilla, but again, I'm not so sure on that front. Although I have to say, there could be some tie-in there with Pontiff, the Painted World, and Priscilla, but I think it all might be coincidental in that case. Pontiff may have been born in a later iteration of the painting, since when the painted world begins to rot, they burn it away and escape into a new painting. So it's possible that Priscilla was long gone by the time Pontiff came around, and that Aldrich's dream was of a distant past. But again, it isn't quite clear. Look, a wiser individual, or a wiser madman, better yet, than I could probably find more meaning here, but me, I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, so here's what we know. Aldrich's dream of future past allowed him to use Priscilla's scythe as an offensive attack in combat. He basically conjured it out of nowhere, complete with its lifesteal effect, so to me that's significant. His soul can literally be turned into a miracle of this very same life hunt scythe attack, which in my opinion can be viewed as a sort of example of how Aldrich's dreams could be brought into the waking world or reality. But that's just one way of looking at it, or how I read into it. I will concede, though, that the most likely reason that Aldrich was dreaming of Priscilla was just because he was eating Gwendolyn, and Gwendolyn knew about Priscilla's existence. It was one of the bigger secrets of Anor Londo, and maybe that's a whole part of Aldrich's thing. Like, he likes to find out what his victim's deepest, darkest secret is, and Gwendolyn's was the existence of his half-breed sister or niece, or, the relation is unclear, but they're still a part of the same family. It lines up pretty well with the Aldrich character as well, but anyway, the fire resurrected a piece of unkindled ash, and she and her hollow companion were straight from Aldrich's past, and they've come back to haunt him, which in this case means to return him to his throne to serve as kindling, but one of them has unfortunately found themselves as the target of a death cult, the unkindled one to be specific, and maybe that's a bit unfair. The Sable Church of Londor is more of an undeath cult than a death one, but you get my meaning. So anyway, Anri and Horus are two blasts from Aldrich's past, and they were two of the orphans that were raised at the Cathedral of Horrors, where they saw stuff that was straight out of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, probably, in terms of cannibalism. But anyway, if Anri manages to succeed in taking Aldrich out, I mean, there's no way that Horus can, because he hollows out in Karthus, but after she potentially succeeds in getting her revenge, she sort of loses the will to live and hollows out. She doesn't even try to link the flame, she just wanted Aldrich dead. But I guess that's a common fate for FromSoft NPCs, although I guess she can actually be spared if you become the Lord of Hollows and stab her through the face, and she comes back as your wife or husband if you picked a female character. But moving on, back to Aldrich's dreams of the deep. Fast forward a bit to the drag heap part of the timeline, and it starts to seem like the age of the deep sea that Aldrich had dreamt of is finally coming to pass. After eons of the fire being relit and fading endlessly, the heaviest bits of humanity have sunk into the very depths of the known world and formed its bedrock, and this has resulted in the Merkmen. Barnacle-covered hollow skeletons lousy with the magics of the deep that they use with shocking efficiency. And when it comes down to it, they can transform into their true forms, which is a monstrous deep spirit, to attack their prey and pursue them, if you will, much like the Pursuers, an old dark spell. Aldrich foretold this, or I guess he rather dreamt it. His bishops were the ones who spread the good word, but from the looks of the drag heap, neither Aldrich nor his deacons would actually live to see the coming of the deep, at least outside of their holy visions. As one of the main bosses of the game, the approach to Aldrich is naturally heavily defended by all manner of his followers, from the deacons to the slugs and to his monstrosities that followed in his footsteps to try and become just like me. He's also hired mercenaries wearing Llewellyn armor from the fallen land of Drang. That could have been Pontiff who did that, but they seem to be more focused on protecting Aldrich than the cracked Pope. Aldrich has even got some of the silver knights of the very god he's currently eating protecting him while he feasts on said god. By the time we meet him, as far as Aldrich is concerned, he's already won. Now, I gotta thank the original FromSoft scholar Loki Lore, whose website has been an endless resource for helping me put together a timeline for the Big Slug and the overall ideology of the Deep. Dude's page rocks. But anyway, yeah, Aldrich probably had the most background, but obviously a lot of it is speculation. So let's move on to Yhorm the Giant, the king of cut content. So good old Yhorm. The jury's still out on whether or not he's an actual giant or just a big dude, with a giant being more or less his semi-title, like Thor's the troll from Vinland Saga. You know, he wasn't actually a troll, he just had the strength of one. And in this case, Yhorm had the size of a giant, so it makes sense he'd be called a giant. He was reportedly the descendant of an ancient conqueror, possibly either High Lord Wolnir based on the size, or maybe even the good old giant lord that attempted to conquer Dranlaik in response to Vendrick invading his lands back in Dark Souls 2's timeline. Could be either one, honestly. I personally do see some resemblance with him and the giant lord. But anyway, his rule of the profaned capital was plagued by distrust from his subjects, so much so that Yhorm offered them a giant slaying sword so that if they felt like they could do a better job, then they could come try him. Let it be said that Yhorm was no tyrant. He was a just ruler, if a bit somber and sullen in his overall demeanor, but he was a good dude. And it was a pretty lonely existence for him since he was despised by so many of his subjects, and Yhorm here, he didn't have a single friend until he met good old Sigurd, or Sigvard. And as we all know, Sigurd here, he counts as like at least 5 friends. I mean, this guy just rocks. He's solid, loyal, funny, he always offering you a drink, and he's a badass. The guy could befriend anyone, and true to his nature, he quickly became Yhorm's only friend. Yhorm would even entrust Sig with another one of the Stormbreakers, the giant slaying swords from Demon Souls. Maybe Yhorm was descended from a giant Sky Manta. But anyway, Yhorm asked Sig to come put him down if it ever came down to it, like if he was ever a threat to his people, or if he became hollow, or if it just became necessary that he need to die. He wanted his friend to do it. And Sig, being the good dude that he was, reluctantly agreed. And this was an oath he would eventually fulfill some eons later. Anyway, eventually Yhorm linked the flame in order to hopefully put an end to the profane flame, or at least stabilize it. That is just a theory, of course. He might have just linked the flame because the flame was fading, but it seemed to have had something to do with the profaned one. But whatever the case, something seems to have went wrong. Due to the descendants of Alsana possibly sabotaging events, Yhorm's linking of the fire caused the profane flame to explode from the sky and burn his subjects to a crisp, while also mutating the individuals responsible into something closer to what could be considered their true forms. So talk about a fucked existence. Even his final act was co-opted and taken from him, mutated into something darker and twisted than what he had intended. The poor guy just couldn't catch a break. And that really became quite literal when Yhorm would be resurrected when the young Prince Lothric refused to link the flame, even as the entire world hollowed out. Now, instead of offering himself up as kindling like he was supposed to, Yhorm skipped on back to the profane capital to see that his original linking of the flame had some pretty fucked up consequences. All those people are dead, burned to a crisp, and fused together into piles in his throne room. Well, either that or they were there to oppose Yhorm when he returned from the grave and he just slaughtered all of them, but that's a lot more simpler of an explanation, although I do suppose it's possible. It does characterize him as a bit of a menace though, doesn't it, that theory? Whatever the case, he definitely seems to have spent most of his time brooding following his resurrection. Now, as Yhorm arose from beyond, so did his good buddy Sigurd in the form of unkindled ash. I guess Sigurd at some point had attempted to link the fire himself, and he just was found lacking. But it allowed him to return around the same time as his good buddy Yhorm, and let's just say old vows were remembered. Now, no one really knows why Yhorm refused to offer himself up as kindling. I like to think it was because of what happened when he linked the flame the first time. I mean, something went horribly wrong and a bunch of people died. people that viewed him as a monster. I think he was unwilling to do that again with the possibility of something going wrong again. So instead, he confines himself to his throne room and is forced to face the consequences of his actions in the form of his charred subjects, while surrounded by all the twisted entities that the profaned capital has become home to. I think that sort of makes sense as to why he didn't go allow himself to be burned willingly this time around. Now, the first flame seems to have accounted for that, which makes sense considering the lords are all connected to it, but that's probably why it specifically brought back an unkindled Sieg word as well as sort of an insurance. Since Sieg possessed one of the only two blades capable of slaying Yhorm, it just makes sense. The Storm Ruler's sword that is Yhorm's greatest weakness is sort of a fun reference to the Demon Souls game where it looked like it was in a lot better shape. In that game, it was used to fight the King of Storms, which was a giant manta ray, and the final boss of Zone 5, but it basically had the same effects and powers, the sword that is, not the manta ray in Yhorm. But anyway, Yhorm is noticeably the only Lord of Cinder without any active protectors. He has incidental ones, sure, like the handmaids and gargoyles, but they aren't loyal to him and they aren't defending him. They just happen to be in the path on the way to him. The individuals that reside in the profane capital do not serve Yhorm, they serve the profane flame, or their own interests, or some weird, diluted, misguided sense of forming a sorcery lineage to Big Hat Logan, but that's a whole other story, and just like one guy. The residents of the capital appear to tolerate his presence only because they can't do anything about it. I mean, what are they going to do? They're way less powerful. His only friendly visitor is a dude who's inevitably there to kill him, or one of two dudes who are there to kill him. So I guess he truly is the Lonely Lord, but let's move on to the small guy. Ludleth of Courland, the only NPC Lord of Cinder in Dark Souls 3. Japanese translations paint him specifically as a pygmy, and the pygmies are important because they are the inheritors of the Dark Soul. They are the ancestors of humanity. But he comes from the land of Courland, which is famous for a unique art known as soul transposition. He has the distinction of being the only one of the lords here that didn't refuse to return to his throne to be used as kindling for an unkindled one to link the flame with. And even more than that, he actually serves as a sort of ally, helping you turn boss souls into cool shit with his magic transposing kiln. The guy's nothing if not helpful, and his transposition is sort of an interesting thing within the universe. We know the magical art itself had existed prior to Dark Souls 3. It was just called different things, or it didn't have a name. Just unique individuals were capable of pulling it off. People like Strayed or Ornifex from Dark Souls 2. But this powerful magic was outlawed in the country that Ludleth comes from, Courland, which of course led to him being exiled from his homeland. And he presumably wandered for a time without any purpose at all, figuring that he would ultimately be another insignificant being in the grand scheme of things. As we know, he was wrong.
I may be but small, but I will die a colossus.
I always like that Ludleth tells you to be kind to the Firekeeper, because as he points out, both of you are basically prisoners of the flame and its eternal linking. I mean, so is he. There's a bit of a shared fate between the three of you, as Ludleth is incapable of doing anything other than playing his part in what's to come. We all have our parts to play, as he says. And this is also in contrast to the other revived lords, who all went off to resume their own affairs after their resurrection, while Ludleth, he didn't. He stuck around. So he sort of looks at us slaying his fellow lords as essentially just helping them along their proper paths, their fates, if you will. He holds no resentment towards them or ill will for their choice to oppose the duty placed on them. He just sort of views them as misguided. Although, as he says, one must choose thine own fate, so I do think he understands, or at the very least respects them and their choices. He just disagrees with them because, it's foolish to go against the world. The fire fades, and instead of going to go link it, what do the lords do? They scatter back to their homes to go about their old business. And again, I respect it, but what did they think was going to happen? I mean, did they really think it was going to be that easy? Did they think that they would be left alone to do their own thing after it brought them back for a very, very specific purpose? Did they not think that there was a contingency for this? The it in this scenario, of course, being the flame. Now, I'm not saying that Ludleth doesn't respect the other lords and their choices, because we know that he does, but at the same time, this is a guy that presumably cut off his own legs to make sure he stayed on his throne, to do what he is supposed to do, meet his fate, if you will, for whatever future there is to come, be it an age of hollows, an age of darkness, or just another trip around the flame. He made his choice to play his part, and sure, you could say he was always committed to staying the course and that he did that, but I think the real reason he's missing his legs is because he needed to cut them off in order to, to make sure that he never wavered in his decision to sit his throne for good. He basically destroyed all other possibilities for himself. I mean, that's the hill he chose to die on, and he made sure of it. I respect that. And shit, he also knows that's why the Unkindled were brought back as well, because the lords weren't doing what they were supposed to do, and instead of fighting the Unkindled, he decides to help them. He knows that the purpose of the Ashen One is to put these foolish ambitions to rest, the ambitions of the lords. And that's true, the Unkindled are basically there to force the lords to face the music and play their part. And knowing all that, it makes complete sense for Ludleth to not go against the Unkindled because, it's not like he'd stand much of a fight anyway. He's essentially resigned himself to his fate, but he's also willing to be helpful while he's still here. We can look at it as noble or maybe even cowardly, and perhaps it's a bit of both. But I do find him to be a pretty interesting character. Now, anyway, we can really only speculate on most of his backstory. It seems that his age in particular faded into one of almost complete darkness. His firekeeper saw things that she was never supposed to see. It was a world without flame, one of apparent and endless darkness. It's something we can see ourselves beneath the consumed king of Lothric's garden. We even get to see an old friend down there, besides Yhorm, the shrine maiden from Dark Souls 2, one of the old ladies. And of course, she hangs out around the main shrine too, but isn't it interesting how she seems to be the only one that notices that some weird timey-wimey shit's going on? But that's a whole subject for a different day. And again, this is all speculation, but we can assume that this was Ludleth's age that we're looking at, or at least something very similar to it. Just, complete darkness. He was presumably made a Lord of Cinder because of the simple fact that as a pygmy, he was an inheritor of the Dark Soul, or at least a piece of the Dark Soul of man. And as we know, the Dark Soul grows in strength as the fire fades. Well, Ludleth's age fell into complete darkness, so I figure his Dark Soul was quite powerful by this point. And also, not even that, I figured by that point, most of the other possibilities or alternatives to link the fire were no longer viable, and Ludleth, owing to the immense strength of his tiny shard of Dark Soul, was the only candidate who proved worthy of the task of linking the flame. And this was something that, judging by Ludleth's nightmares, was quite painful and traumatizing for the little lord. That's kind of what makes him a badass though, because here he is, more than ready to offer himself up to burn yet again for the good of the realm. Dude's so ready that he cut his legs off as insurance. I think it's admirable. A certified honored madman moment, even if it's for reasons I don't necessarily agree with. But I think that sums up Ludleth. I mean, this dude's really ready to relive his most grand yet also his most horrifying and traumatic moment. That shit takes dedication and resolve, so again, it is respected. But yeah, that's Ludleth. Now let's move on to the one lord that is in actuality a gang of dudes. Yes, a very iconic lord. FromSoft's less overt, but still very on the nose homage to the French film The Brotherhood of the Wolf. So, the Abyss Watchers, a collective Lord of Cinder. These individuals all share the blood of the old wolf, which sort of bound their souls together, which is a very fascinating concept. I imagine there's some sort of hive mind consciousness that's shared between the group, or at least maybe there was. The Undead Legion of Farron, which was another name that they were referred to as, was born in the ashes of Darkroot Garden, which itself was the overgrown remains of the ancient kingdom of Ulasil, known for its golden sorceries. Over time, Ulasil turned into Darkroot, and then eons passed by, and now the area is known as Farron, at least from what I could tell. The Legion was inspired by the legends of the lands, namely the deeds of Artorias and the unnamed chosen undead that together made up the legend of the Abyss Walker that defeated Manus and saved the day. They basically wanted to follow this example of combating the Abyss and its influence and creatures, watching for it and striking at it before it could spread. The core members of this elite ranger unit partook in a shared imbibing of the Old Wolf's blood, presumably the blood of the Old Wolf of Farron, which could sort of maybe be a descendant of Sif, or could just be another great wolf that they found and decided to drink its blood. But whatever the reason, they bound each other together with this blood, and it gave them enhanced abilities. And they basically went around leveling whole kingdoms the minute they showed any evidence or signs of falling to the abyss. And the Watchers were quite good at it. They were fierce combatants now that they were uplifted by this wolf blood. But that is essentially how they went about stopping the spread of the abyss. They would just take out cities and places that were slowly starting to fall to it. They would destroy the target before it could be fully consumed, which I guess is for the best. You can't really blame their methods. I mean, this group of dudes emerged from the area that was once known as Ulasil all those years ago, and as we know, Ulasil famously fell to the abyss. Who knows how the legends and myths of all that had been skewed over the following centuries. But anyway, the Watchers were largely successful in their crusades, and their numbers grew. They recruited even more undead into the Legion, but again, only the main handful of members possessed the shared wolf's blood, while individuals like the crestfallen fellow Hawkwood were full-fledged members of the Legion, but weren't connected to the main Abyss Watchers by the wolf blood. He was still a bit newer. Not in the inner circle of things. Maybe that's why he turned his attention towards becoming a dragon. But anyway, we're getting a little off topic. In addition to having their very own Andre the Blacksmith, the Legion hired this supposed disciple of the legendary sorcerer Big Hat Logan, and this sage would instruct some of the lesser members of the Legion in the ways of crystal sorcery. The Legion also had a special vanguard force known as the Farron Followers, who basically trailed around tidying up the messes left behind by the main Abyss Watchers unit after they took out a kingdom. Down the road, after the main Abyss Watchers linked the flame, the followers would lose their purpose and wander around a bunch until they found a new home in the Forlorn Painting. Now, back to the Legion. Much like their inspiration and patron saint Artorias, the Watchers' line of work made them a lot more susceptible to the corruption of the Abyss, as evidenced by the black tendrils crawling up the capes that they wear, hinting at their eventual fate, to be consumed. So anyway, because of the Abyss Watchers' wolf blood connected nature, when they stood before the kiln and linked the flame, it counted the Watchers as one being because they shared a soul. Basically, they became a Lord of Cinder together. Then when they came back, they returned home to Farron Woods, where they appear to be protected by a primitive goatman race known as the Gru. It makes sense that they'd want to return here, as they likely wanted to ensure that they weren't found by their many enemies, or better yet, the Unkindled, because they've definitely got a lot of people coming for those heads. The Gru seemingly revere them, so they're there to add an extra layer of protection. Now, in addition to the various natural defenses provided by the woods, such as the poison swamp as well as its heavily overgrown nature, the Watchers also had a series of 3 torch-controlled walls that protected their inner sanctum, and the paths were extensively guarded by the Savage Gru and massive Elder Sorcerer Gru goats, so the path was nothing if not treacherous. But then again, this is FromSoft, so what do we expect? This confusing labyrinth of roots and toxic sludge seems to have successfully deterred at least one Dark Wraith, but the same couldn't be said for his colleagues. Looks like Londor sent their best this time. But anyway, the Watchers themselves remain largely undisturbed by all of this and are instead attempting to purge the red-eyed, abyss-afflicted members from its own rank, but their shared wolf blood has made that sort of difficult. It's resulted in an unending combat situation between the former brothers in arms. It's funny, yet predictable in terms of an end result for a militant bunch of Artorias cosplayers, if you ask me. The Abyss sort of always wins out in the end. It's poetic, in a way. And this is probably also why they didn't go sit their thrones and link the fire again, because they awoke in their grand mausoleum and found that some of their members were greatly afflicted with the abyss, as evidenced on their capes. So they promptly went to town on them. They started fighting in this never-ending melee. Anyway, what else is there? Oh yeah, Hawkwood, one of the Legion members without the wolf blood, was brought back as an unkindled, perhaps for the sole purpose of sending the Watchers back to their throne. But he has no real desire to do this, and instead he just wants to become a dragon. It's a whole thing that I'll probably cover in another video, but let's stop getting off track and move on to our final entry, the little dweeb himself, Lothric, the younger prince, and Lorien as well, but we'll get to that. So Lothric here technically isn't a real Lord of Cinder because he rejected his destiny to link the flame and become a lord, the very purpose of his existence, which is something I respect. I think it's always pretty cool to reject your fate, especially if you've been born and bred for this specific purpose. So yeah, he's not really a Lord of Cinder, and he wouldn't even be on this list if not for the fact that he's basically the sole reason why the other Lords of Cinder have been resurrected and subsequently need to be returned to their crusty old thrones in the first place. This was his turn to link the fire, not ours or anyone else's, certainly not any unkindled ashes. This was supposed to be on Lothric. In a way, we can view him as at least partially responsible for everything that has happened, everything that the resurrected lords have caused since their, resurrection. Now, the flip side of all this doom and gloom is that his rejection of his fate presents certain unique opportunities for our unkindled to shape the very future of the world. Opportunities that certainly wouldn't be present or possible if he had just mindlessly towed the line like he was meant to do. So Lothric is important. A lot of the outcomes of the game wouldn't be possible if not for him. Whether he knows it or not, the man who sold the world. So yeah, not a lord, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we get the Lord Slain caption title thing upon his defeat, so I had to include the guy. So let's get right into it. This little pipsqueak is the current heir of the Kingdom of Lothric, famous for its wyvern riders and giant wall. He was born extremely weak and frail, but as we mentioned, he was destined to link the flame, something that took strength to do. And apparently it's what he was born to do, but again, he was absurdly weak, so it was a bit of a contradiction. I mean, this dude couldn't even walk on his own, he could only crawl. Now, his brother Lorien, on the other hand, was a much more capable warrior. I mean, the dude was a literal demon slayer, and he was good at what he did. Put it this way, he was so good at killing powerful demons, it was at the point where his sword was quite literally stained with the chaos fire of its many battles. I mean, just from that description, it sounds like the dude was a genuine anime character. But see, that was all before he had his soul and by extension his very being, let alone his fate, irrevocably tied to his miserable little brother. Back when Lorien was still his own person, a time we don't really get to see. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. Lothric obviously had trouble standing and was forced to crawl around on the floor or be carried. The Holy Prince possessing defects like this certainly didn't inspire hope and may have actually been the result of genetic tampering within the Lothric bloodline from scholars and mages in service to the Holy Line, attempting to tailor-make its heirs into the ideal candidates to link the flame. Just speculation, of course. Lothric may have been weak, but he was highly intelligent and skilled in sorcery or miracles or some sort of hybrid between the two. More on that though in a bit. The head scholar of the Grand Archive became the young Lothric's mentor and maybe even steered him towards the idea to not link the fire, but that's a big maybe. The head scholar himself has been speculated to have been anyone from Aldea, the scholar of the First Sin, to Pontiff Sullivan, to the bearer of the curse from Dark Souls 2, or possibly even none of the above. But that last possibility is no fun. Me personally, I subscribe to it having been either Aldea or some successor of his, based specifically on that sorcery we find Soul Geyser, or Soul Stream as it's now called. And I do think it would make a lot of sense with what we know about Aldea. He knew the darker, more ancient truths of the world, and his attempt at breaking the chains forced upon man by the gods of gold basically cost him everything, from his literal humanity to his very being. Plus, the guy tied himself to the bonfires in a way that I think would make it still possible for him to manifest by the time Lothric was around. But again, all speculation. Then there's the more circumstantial stuff, like that Aldia had to have been the head scholar of the archive because he was famously known as a scholar, which again is a weak reasoning, but to me it lines up. But let's get back to Lothric. Anyway, because the young prince was so weak, a curse was placed on him and his brother that bound their very souls together, which effectively crippled Lorien with the same affliction that Lothric had, although it didn't bother him as he truly did embrace his brother's curse wholeheartedly. This was presumably done in hopes that the two of them combined would provide sufficient kindling for the flame, although it didn't really matter. They never even attempted to link it. Lothric had no desire to become kindling, and he was content to watch his lands fall apart as a civil war broke out between the ranks of his armies, and his father horrifically mutated himself into a sad, pathetic lizard in an attempt to become the new Seath. As we briefly mentioned earlier, Lothric fights using some sort of hybrid between sorcery and miracles that looks strangely similar to the magic of the angels. You know, those hyper-offensive creatures from the Dreg Heap that themselves look suspiciously similar to the Dark Lurker of Dark Souls 2. Now, the fact that Lothric's magic resembles theirs could be significant considering that he was Gertrude's half-brother, and his mentor, of course, was the head scholar that oversaw all those nutty experiments that were done to her, so I do think it's possible that the magic could have been discovered through this research into Gertrude, but I also think it's possible that Lothric and his half-sister maybe they understood each other. I mean, Lothric went against the Three Pillars and decided against linking the flame. We know angels can only exist at the end of a very stagnated world, so perhaps he was trying to help bring Gertrude's vision to life. It could explain why his attacks look similar to those of the angels of the Dark Lurker outside of it just being a coincidence. And if you look around the palace of Lothric, it appears that he also has got several statues of angels on the way to his boss room, and that statue of him guarded by an angel knight appears to be sitting on a pillar that is held up by two stone angels, so I do think it's possible that he was throwing in his lot with the angelic faith of Gertrude, his half-sister. See, at one point Gertrude was visited by an angelic messenger. The insane experimentation that was done on her by the scholars, though, had rendered her unable to speak, write, see, or hear, but she still attempted to record this visit. This story was contained in the Divine Pillars of Light, I believe, miracle, but they were mostly just illegible scrawlings. And it was said that ordinary men couldn't understand these scrawlings that described her visit from the angelic messenger, but of course Lothric was no ordinary man. He was noble, he was a noble, and he was intelligent. He had access to the forbidden knowledge through his mentor, the first scholar in the Grand Archives. So maybe he saw more than just chicken scratch and mindless scrawlings in Gertrude's accounts, more than ordinary men would see. And maybe that's where he found his salvation. Maybe he was saved, in a sense, by the angelic faith, and that's why he did what he did. But again, this is all speculation. But what else to say about Lothric? Now, I guess from a gameplay perspective, I'm not a really big fan of his boss fight, but he's not so bad, I guess. There's worse ones out there. He's just a little annoying with the healing, and that's only if you let him heal. What the fight does have that I always enjoy is the very cool lead up to the boss room with the waves of increasingly stronger Lothric forces set to the backdrop of an eclipse while ascended Gertrude knights watch on from their perch and pilgrim butterflies crowd up the skies. It's a very cool aesthetic and cinematic moment. 10 out of 10 just for the vibe of it all, and that's not a word I enjoy saying. It's also very thematic. Now, I'm just going out on a limb here, but it seems like the eclipse represents an end to things, at least possibly. The Age of Fire in particular, and the possible beginning of something new. I mean, just look at it. The darkness had overtaken the sun. The fact that it resembles the dark sign probably isn't a coincidence. I like to look at the eclipse as representing the always inevitable outcome that Gwyn feared. Darkness, even in its subdued state, would eventually grow strong enough to bring down the sun. Can't really blame the guy for being scared. On a side note though, when it comes to this whole boss lead up when at the end of the game with the eclipse and Lothric, it's also interesting to me that even in their hollowed out state, the forces of Lothric protect the air that doomed them all to this very fate. It adds a slight layer of tragedy to it, like they really were just drones, or cogs, if you will. They likely had autonomy before they hollowed out, but only in word only though, because they weren't really living for themselves, they were living for the royal line, and now that's really all they're doing, defending it with their rotting husks. Lothric also has the distinction of being defended by 3 named NPCs, one of which is the poster guy from Dark Souls 2 with a big ass axe, so that's pretty cool. One is the last of the Black Hand of Lothric, Kamui, a guy who wields a wakizashi and a katana. And the last is a crystal sorceress that invaded you early on and then again in the Untended Graves. But they really don't have much lore to them. I mean, I guess Kamui might. I believe 2 of them at the very least are summonable allies for other boss fights. But at this point, I'm just rambling off random facts about minor NPCs. So I do believe I got to everything that I could think of. If I did forget something, please let me know in the comments. And again, I apologize for the delay this video had. It was not meant to be this long in production, if you will. As I always say, I am working on my output, or at least the volume of it, which is really just a fancy-pantsy way of saying I'm working on increasing the number of videos I'm making, but that's a whole other thing, and you guys don't want to hear my various explanations and all that good stuff, so let's just have our outro and then the final thoughts, shall we? As always, though, I hope you guys found this video to be at least somewhat informative or entertaining, and if you liked the video, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it, and if you like hearing me ramble on about these various topics at varying lengths, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. We're almost at 50k, which is something I'm really proud of. I mean, we're almost at 40k, but that's just 10 away from 50. So yeah, that's enough rambling. There is a Patreon you can join if you feel like helping support the channel, but I don't like to talk about that too much because it feels like e-begging. It's like a whole thing. But yeah, let's stop rambling and have the outro and then our final thoughts, shall we? So I'm realizing that my new mic might not be very good at picking up the sounds and the ambiance of the alchemy lab, so I'm gonna have to work on that. I guess that's what they make instruction manuals for, though, right? Alright, so for some final thoughts, there's not really much left to say about the Lords of Cinder that has not been said in this video, again, that I can remember. But I will let you guys know what the next FromSoft video will be, the next Dark Soulsian video. And it'll probably be the Children of Gwyn, but I'm working on some Demon Soul stuff as well. I also recently realized that I can, in fact, record gameplay while playing Fallout 1 and 2, or Fallout Tactics. I did not know I could do this because previously every time I tried, my screen record wouldn't come up, and I couldn't really figure out how to do it on OBS. But it turns out if you just play the game in classic mode, you can screen record audio and video like you can many other things on your computer. At least for Fallout 1 and 2, because it does not let you do that if you play the non-classic mode version or whatever. Or at least it didn't let me, so I've been pretty psyched about that. I've been playing through Fallout 1 and 2 again to get some nice gameplay videos and working some topics together. And it's weird because, you know, when I first played these games, Fallout 1 and 2, I think I first bought them. I bought a laptop to play a bunch of different PC games that I really needed to play. It was like, I don't know, 2015 or 16, like fucking 10 years ago. I of course didn't play Fallout 1 and 2 until like 2018 or something like that, but even then when I played them, I feel like I didn't appreciate the first one enough because it took some getting used to, and then by the time I got to 2 I was loving it, and I would always say Fallout 2 was superior to 1, but I'm starting to disagree there. But again, I am rambling, and this has been the final thoughts. Honestly, that's usually what we do here. The main takeaway is that there might be a video coming out soon about how Fallout 1 is probably the best overall story in the entire Fallout series. It's also got the best world building and tone, I feel like, for the entire series as well, which might sound like me just being another case of old good, new bad, but I can appreciate the new as well, whilst still praising the old, right? So if anybody's still listening, thank you for listening as always, and you will be hearing from me very soon with either the next FromSoftian video, the next Falloutian video, or maybe something different. And as always, I am really trying to work on the output of videos. But yeah, until next time, everybody be safe, and yeah, see ya.
I pity the sorry souls. Is that really Lordship's last reward?